We next have our interview with Allan Stypeck of Second Story Books all over the Washington, D.C. area. And Allan, could you just fill us in on your background, where you were born, brought up, schools, what got you involved in the book business, why you opened an open store, etc. Just ramble on and start at the beginning.
Okay, I was born in Brooklyn in 1950. Moved out from Long Island when I was 12, went to college at the American University School of International Service, where I majored in urban political economics and political science international relations. My intention when I graduated from my undergraduate, my intention was to go either into the CIA or into the State Department. I was in the process of taking my entry examinations and a variety of other job applications when my girlfriend from college, who was later my first wife, and I decided that because of her background, being in an international environment might not be appropriate. So I took a 6-month leave of absence from my applications and decided to travel up and down the East Coast buying books and antiques for a friend of hers who had opened up a antique store in Bethesda, Maryland, which is a fairly high profile part of the DC metropolitan area. The first purchase I did was for myself, which was a collection of antiquarian books, including American history, international histories, and law, and some books which I bought which had bindings specifically for the antique store. Brought the books down to the Washington area, put them onto shelves, got a call 3 days later that the books that I bought for the bookstore, the people didn't want, but every book I bought that I liked, somebody made an offer on. And I had only put the books I bought for myself in the bookcases to basically embellish the bookcase itself that the woman was trying to sell for like $20,000. So it was one of these very strange situations. So I had to decide if I wanted to actually sell books that I bought for myself versus going and finding similar books. So I did a combination of both. I sold a couple of the books that I thought I could find duplicate copies of, and then went back up and down the East Coast and started picking books specifically for a clientele that was being nurtured by this individual. Within 3 months, my wife and I decided this was a very nice lifestyle. We were traveling, we were meeting a lot of very interesting people. I was basically doing something I enjoyed because I really enjoyed book collecting, which I had started when I was about 5 years old. I was always a voracious collector of anything. I studied archaeology when I was in junior high school, worked as an intern at the Brooklyn Museum in the Egyptology department, and throughout my high school years, I collected African studies, both books and ephemeral material, artifacts, and areas of other indigenous cultures from around the world. So it wasn't like I did this just after I left school. I had an interest in it. Within about 5 months of that time, and this is in 1973, I accumulated a small mini warehouse full of books, and I had no place to put them. So the antique store was not the appropriate venue for me because they had very limited space. So I decided at that time to get my first copy of AB. And I started sending out postcards from a second story or a second floor apartment in an 18-story building. My sales were not significant, so I decided to then start taking some books to a local flea market where I started selling them by the box or in boxes. And that became a fairly lucrative income. Then I started going to estate sales, and the defining moment in Second Story Books was when a fellow ABAA dealer named Paul Collins in 1974 opened up Second Story Books on the second floor on Connecticut Avenue. Within a month or two, he was very dissatisfied with being a retailer, and at that time we had bought and sold a couple of collections together. Said, would you like to buy the bookstore? I told my wife at that time that I said I made a vow I would never be a retail bookseller. In about 3 minutes, I made the decision to become a retail bookseller, got a loan, from a local bank. And this was a Friday afternoon, went to my bank, told them that I needed to get a loan, and on Monday morning, the loan application was approved. This is, remember, 1974, when things could actually be done.
Yeah.
Right? And I told Paul, I paid Paul for the store, lock, stock, and barrel, and I became the owner of Second Story Books. And that was the first retail store I had. And then it just evolved from there. My high watermark of ownership was 6 stores simultaneous in the Washington, Baltimore area. And now I've pared down, this is 2009, now I have 2 locations in Washington. I just recently renovated my DuPont Circle store, which I opened in 1977, which is probably one of the best retail locations in the country for books and has the right clientele. There's the combination of residential, commercial, that has most of the think tanks are right around there, Brookings, the Cato Institute, a variety of different important institutions that are used academically and policy directed. So we have the right clientele, and tourism. And I just renovated the store, put a considerable amount of money, I might say my kids' college education funds have now been dedicated to the store, and I made a decision that I'm going to maintain the store probably for the rest of my life. My other bookstore that I presently have is my Rockville warehouse, which has about 25,000 square feet. I've never counted the books, it's never been an issue about quantity, but I am going to redefine that location in August and pare that down to about half the size, maintain a fairly credible internet website, both on Amazon and the regular internet search engines, A-Libris, Abe, etc., with a dedicated inventory of somewhere between 1 and 300,000 select titles. We're not interested to carry repetitive inventory inexpensively and simultaneously maintain the high-profile, rare, and used bookstore on DuPont Circle. The other direction that I've gone in since about 1980 is I joined the American Society of Appraisers in the early 80s and became a senior member with a discipline dedicated to books, manuscripts, and autographs. And presently I appraise probably about 75% of my working days dedicated to appraising. My clientele includes the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian. I'm Henry Kissinger's personal archivist. I work with a variety of other senators and individuals within cabinet levels doing work for them either as an archivist and or as an appraiser for donation purposes. I work with a lot of the major institutions, also a lot of the colleges, and I found that in all the years that I've been working, this is probably the most satisfactory part of my career. Not only do I get the opportunity to talk to very important people in the sense of their positions in our society, Nobel Prize winners, scholarly individuals. I also am partially involved in actual ongoing history, and I also deal with past history and past academic and substantive areas in medicine, a variety of the other sciences. So it's a full plate, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to be everything. This will stay the same until the time I go wherever you go when you're gone. Yeah. You know.
Talk a little bit about your internet experiences. Were you an early interneter? Did you come lately? Did you find it difficult?
I'm embarrassed to say this because I believe it's true, but I don't want to pull an Al Gore that I invented the internet. But the company that preceded A-Libris was named Interlock.
Right.
In the early 1980s. They were out of Baltimore, and they approached me in, I think, 1992 to catalog 8,000 books for their beta test for the internet. So if I'm not mistaken, that might have been the first 8,000 books that were ever put on the internet.
I think you probably was.
Right, and all I can tell you was I hired an individual who later became the co-host of the radio show The Book Guys, which was on NPR from 1997 to, unfortunately, March of 2009. We just discontinued the show because I couldn't get underwriting for the future of the show, and because of the present economic situation. And he was the person who took the embryonic internet system that was given, we were given $1 a book to do 8,000 books. And he took that embryonic inventory and built a computer system to house it based on the materials that were given to us by Interlock. I think we sold $250 worth of books the first year. I remember selling a book for $30 and we threw a party. Right, and I think the party cost me $400. Right. So, for about...
You've been in it since the beginning.
I would have to assume yes. I mean, I don't have any reason to doubt that.
What percentage of your business comes from the internet?
It's proportionate to the amount of time and energy we apply to it. At the present time, I would say about 35%. And that's only because our staffing is restricted to X amount of people, and having 2 open bookstores, doing the appraisals, fulfillment of purchasing and the obligations to the store, we have probably at any given time 50 to 150,000 books which sit dormant, which haven't been processed. If I integrated a larger staff that I felt were qualified to recognize the value of the books and properly catalog them, I would assume our internet sales would increase proportionately. Yeah. And at this point, because of my reconstruction of Second Story from a 6 open shop store to a 2 open shop store concept, the internet will take more priority than what it did in the past. So my assumption is that at this point, about a third, it probably will go up to about a half. And that's my future prospects are as far as how I want to approach the selling books in the 21st century.
Talk a little bit about the book guys. Even though you've just mentioned they've been discontinued, that doesn't mean it's over with.
No.
Why don't you start with the beginning? How did it begin? What happened over the period of time, some of the accomplishments, and it's a great program, and I think people should know about it.
Okay. In 1980, my co-host Mike Cuthbert's wife came to my main location, which at that time was in Georgetown, D.C. And embarrassed to say this, I had a snake for a pet. I had an 8-foot Burmese python. And she came into the store, and I was upstairs in my office, and I had the python around my neck. And I also have a dog, or had a dog at the time, which was my faithful, loyal companion. And I had a parrot. And so she came upstairs, and I had a dog sitting next to me, a parrot on my shoulder or on the side, and a snake around my neck.
I would have left.
Well, she called up her husband, who was a radio talk show host on, at that time, on NBC, on NBC, and said, "You got to meet this guy. He owns this really great bookstore, and he has a snake. He has a pet snake." So, I did a show at 10 o'clock at night in the local NBC studios on book collecting. In radio parlance, there's a term called a full board. If you have a call-in show, and all the lights light up, that's a full board. That's heaven for a talk show host. That means people are listening. Yeah. Within 1 minute, we had a full board, and I answered in an hour about 35 questions. I couldn't answer the questions fast enough. And Mike said, "We've never had this before. We've never had this kind of interest other than in a calamity where people are calling. Yeah. This is a soft show. It's not a hot show, which is politically related or something which could be confrontational. This was a nice, easygoing show." So he said, "I'd like to have you back again as a guest." So over a period of about 8 years, he was on NBC. Then he went on to on to NPR, WAMU, and then he went on to another station. I was a periodic guest. Every single time, the show did exceptionally well. He'd invite me back. We'd have the same situation. In 1990, we discussed the possibility of collaborating together and creating a show called The Book Guys. At that time, there was a show called The Car Guys, which had just started. Yeah. So we were thinking about calling The Car Guys and doing back-to-back The Book Guys and The Car Guys. Mike got an opportunity to go up to Boston and work for RKO and be the talk show host there. And he said, "Would you mind, would this be a problem if I went up to Boston and took this job and didn't do the show with you?" I said, "Mike, listen, this is a golden opportunity for you." So you have no choice. So we went up to Boston. It didn't work out with him in Boston. He came back a couple of years later, as I said before. He then became the person who created my first computer system for the internet books. And in about then he got a part-time gig as a talk show host on WRC, in Washington, which was the NBC affiliate he had been working with when I originally met him. So I did a show with him in RC, same situation, full board. Even the weather telephone number was being called into for people asking questions. So then we went to AMU, and we did a show for C-SPAN. And we got, no exaggeration, 2,700 phone calls. I had gone, the day afterwards, I went on vacation for Easter, and I was having people calling me from Mexico, from Canada, wanting me to answer questions about books. So I said, Mike, we got to resurrect this. So we decided to form a partnership. I underwrote the show. And in 1997, we went public with the show on 50-yard stations. That show stayed for 12 years. And we simultaneously would do shows on C-SPAN, 2 to 5 shows a year, depending on their interest of our client base or our guest base. And the show was successful. The problem that happened with us with the book guys was a combination of NPR's corporate side taking over production of all the stations and demanding that the stations carry their NPR-produced shows versus independently produced shows, of which National Public Radio was originally created for. So each of the local stations could, in fact, then have their choice of what they wanted to play. When NPR Corporation, which is All Things Considered, or PRI, Public Radio International, which is now another name, created their shows and put together packages, they forced stations to take, if you wanted, let's say, All Things Considered, you had to take 4 shows. They wouldn't give you ATC unless you got all of them, which meant that all the local stations were now forced to take some of their indies out and put these block packages together, which was more cost effective for them because they didn't need engineers. I learned very quickly the whole nuances of being a radio person versus being a bookseller. So now I was living these 2 lifestyles simultaneously. And because the radio show that we did was pretty much dedicated to an older audience, as NPR started to see they were losing part of their audience, not too many young people, we weren't getting a lot of affiliates to pick us up. Underwriting the show was okay as long as I felt that there was some kind of return on it, either doing live appearances or getting collections or somehow getting the nature of the book out to the public. But with this current economic situation and the fact that now both of my girls are at college level age, I had to look to the harsh reality of economics, which is I have to put up $100,000 a year to put my girls through college. So all of a sudden, I have a $400,000 a year obligation, and I could not underwrite the show unless I was getting some guaranteed return on it, which doesn't exist. So I went to a variety of different potential underwriters, including people that I do appraising for, major corporations, and I got the same response, that they were actually suspending projects internally because the money was drying up. And obviously, if you read the papers and you hear how many stations are closing down, newspapers, etc., the last of the industries which are being prioritized for money are not the industries in print or the radio industry. Right. So, independent show, no support, underwritten by yourself, kids going to college. It was pretty much a no-brainer. I regret doing it, and the future of the show now is potentially in a collaboration with a couple of my best guests. Regular guests, Mark Dimunation at the Library of Congress, Nick Basbanes, the writer on Books, and collaborating with C-SPAN and doing periodic shows on C-SPAN and modifying the book guys into more of a forum on book collecting and having a periodic show where we still bring in an author or we bring in a collection, but less the call-ins that we had now about values of books and more substantive information about the history of the book, the history of collections, and where we're going in the 21st century. It won't be a weekly show, but I'm pretty sure we'll do 4 to 8 shows a year. I think it's probably a perfect balance based on the circumstances.
Well, as a guy who has owned his own business for a large number of years, what would you say to some young person or middle-aged person who came to you and said, Allan, I think I'd like to be in the book business. What would be your advice?
I just sold a substantial amount of books to an individual who did just that. And the first thing I said was, I'm going to say this to you unprejudicially. You're doing this on your own. You're making your decision as an adult. I would suggest that you read everything you possibly can read about the current economics, about the future of the book, the shows that I've done with the National Endowment for the Humanities and all the other librarian-related associations, ALA, etc., all have very discouraging information to provide. The statistics are definitely not in the favorable direction. But if you're enamored by books and you want to be part of this society, this culture, go for it. Keep your day job.
But don't lose your day job.
Yeah, keep your day job.
Keep your day job.
And enjoy it. And if you decide you're going to make this a life experience, if you lived large beforehand, be ready to make a serious change in your income, unless you happen to be in a situation where you have a clientele, which, quite frankly, as every bookseller knows, is a highly volatile situation. And buy wisely. Don't assume you can sell everything. And don't make mistakes of overexpanding. I did an appraisal about 4 years ago for a company in Minnesota that was looking to sell their business, a bookseller of some standings. And I did this definitive analysis of the whole business and helped them make the decision to sell the bookstore and at what price. And when I was coming back on the plane, I said to myself, you know, Allan, you just gave the best advice on earth to somebody and you got paid for it. You don't even take your own advice. Read this report, because this is indicative of everything you have done wrong in 30 years, and it's indicative of everything you've done right. Learn by your own reports. And that was my wake-up call. And it really taught me that as booksellers, we sometimes have to basically step back and look at who we are, because we've got caught up in a rhythm of the book sale lifestyle or the bookstore lifestyle, and we forget that society and academics and all the accumulation of information that we were once a primary source of providing has now changed radically. It doesn't mean that we are obsolete. We will be, maybe not within our lifetime, but within 2 or 3 generations, we'll be a tactile, historic, we'll be museum pieces with very limited need for our information on a primary level. That doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means evolution. It would be like owning a stable in 1935. Everything goes in its proper direction. If you look at library studies, if you look at MLAs, library people getting degrees in library studies, 50% of their work is now done on computers, if not more. I've had librarians come in with their classes to look at books because they never look at books in their own library. I mean, these are all realities. And if that's the direction we're going, we have to modify accordingly. It's not going to happen within our lifetime, but it will happen. So if you're coming into this as an entry level and you're a younger individual, let's say you're in the 20s and 30s, you should make a real hard look at where you're going to be at 50 or 60 to make sure. And to give somebody advice that, oh, it's a great lifestyle, it might be temporarily. But it's more a labor of love than it is a labor of money. I mean, you look at how many people do the book fairs. It's almost like living in a circus world. Every week you pack up, you go somewhere else. There are booksellers in this building right now that probably do 30 book fairs a year. And we only have, 4 in the ABAA, 3 in the ABA annual? And if you count the iLab sales, 5 max?
Maybe,
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So where are these other 27? They exist. And people do that. And if that's the lifestyle they've chosen, or if they keep an open store, or if they do it on the internet, or a combination of all, God bless them. Because we are a culture that, if done properly, provide a lot of information, a lot of history, a lot of required material that is not going to be found somewhere else. And, okay, you got the big 800-pound gorilla in the back of the room with the Kindle or the Google projects. Yep, eventually they're going to absorb what we do.
Yeah.
And, It's just, I don't mind being, who is it in Dickens, Fenwick, who is the, always threw a good party, in Christmas Carol, Scrooge and Marley work for him, and they buy him out, anything of the past, but the one thing they remember was they always threw a good Christmas party, That's how I look at book selling. We always throw a good fair, enjoy it, and live with it, because that's who we are. We've made this our life. We've made this our obligation, and in fact, it is an obligation. We could back out of it, find a different form of income, probably make a lot more money on the average, right? Lot less hassles. But I think everybody that has made their decision, has given their dedication to it, has done it for one particular reason, regardless of how much money they're making, is it's a lifestyle they feel provides to some extent in the pursuit of knowledge in whatever capacity. And we all contribute to that. And I think that's what bonds everybody here together.
In the few minutes we have left, when you first started in the trade and during your early years as a bookseller, were there mentors, people who you looked up to, you got advice from, or that helped you? And on the same token, are you having to be a mentor to some booksellers nowadays?
Sure. When I first started, I looked up locally. Larry McMurtry was and is a very dear friend. His knowledge of books was superior to mine. William Matheson from the Library of Congress, I still think is probably the greatest bookman of the 20th century. He was a man who just had more than one synapse of his mind than most of us have combined. There were 8 early ABAA booksellers that helped me out. I mean, and none of them were really individually the one person, but it was a combination of a lot of people that I felt were both ethically, knowledgeably, and professionally reasonable in their approaches and were worth listening to and gave me advice and were willing to talk, which was the great thing, because in many circumstances this is a competitive business. And people will resist or be resistant to giving advice because it could come back. I remember somebody wrote an article about Second Story and did a map of all the employees at Second Story that had opened up bookstores around the country, if not in the world. And I had, at one point, 40 ex-employees that were still involved in book selling. It's about 15 years ago. And I've had over 350 people, and I would say at least 100 of those people, to some extent, after working at Second Story, have gone out and worked in the book community. Many of those I've mentored. Some of them I haven't had much connection with. Other people come in and ask advice. I think because of the Book Guys, the radio show, mentoring with me is more of a monthly or a weekly interrelationship of communicating what book selling is all about. So I've had many people call me up and ask me about my ideas of opening a bookstore. As I said before, do it with caution, but it's a labor of love more than anything else, and know what you're doing. And in many circumstances, it's like mini mentoring. People have consolidated questions or consolidated areas, and you help them out to the best of your capacity. If you can't, you also have this wonderful organization which you can turn to other people. And combining that world, the ABAA world, with the world I have at the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, you have really an embarrassment of riches when it comes to people to call. I mean, I can pick up the phone and call a curator of a museum or call a librarian at a major institution or an ABAA specialist and be able to say, this is a question that somebody wants answered. I may not know the answer, but I know I can give it to somebody who's reliable to give it. And that's what made this business enjoyable, was that kind of continuity of interrelationships.
Are you going to stay with 2 shops, or are you going to consolidate to 1?
Eventually, I think, I'll have my little corner nook where, the old man will come in and all the young kids will come in and say, look at that artifact, and I'll sit there with the book. But, based on the obligation to a very good staff who basically run the internet business, I'll always maintain that. And if it stays status quo from now to the end of Second Story Books, I won't have any issues.
Great. Thanks for the interview. Sure. Thanks for the time, Alan.
Thanks.
It was very interesting. I enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. Thanks.